So in reading Spengler, I decided to go back the discussion about Spengler and his ideas about kultur versus civilization and the disintegration of culture into civilization and the rise of the modern late megalopolitan civilization with its ideas of society motivated only on politics, economics, and social problems, as opposed to the old kultur idea in which civilization was motivated by art and myth and metaphysics. It stimulated me to go back and reread Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, which represents a critique of these kinds of values. And indeed, the interesting thing about this book is that it was written during World War II, and it represents a sort of a third set of values outside the values of the world's, the two different, we might say the two different utopian visions fought during World War II on behalf of the Allies versus the Axis powers. We might say that World War II was a battle over utopias. Which utopian vision would prevail? Would it be the utopian vision of the Nazis with their regression to an archaic theocratic state of kultur values in which Hitler, for example, wanted to completely rebuild Berlin and rename it as the city of Germania, using his architect Albert Speer to go back and recode the city to undo its late megalopolitan status as a mere cosmopolis with decadent values, the cabarets, gays and prostitutes, and decadent art and cafe life, and the whole world of that supports the decadent liberal avant-garde, the bourgeois intellectual. All of that, which is symptomatic, as Spengler has pointed out, of the late megalopolitan type of world city, which renders the previous culture capitals provincial. Hitler wanted to go back and recode the city of Berlin and lay on it, over it, a fresh set of codes to recode it in Deleuze's sense of coding the flows. By putting on top of all this sort of utopian vision of a regression to a culture capital in which you have no gas stations, parking lots, shopping malls, iron and glass architecture as initiated by the French, the American shopping mall mentality, none of that, but to overlay instead a neoclassical, a sort of decadent, a decayed, petrified, stiffened version of a neoclassical world where all the buildings are made up out of stone, lining a long, straight avenue, which is suitable, the old Baroque vision of long cities laid out along long, straight, wide boulevards so that armies can march down them in parade fashion, with the buildings standardized and homogenized, no iron and glass architecture, and at the end of the strip, the world's largest dome ever built, 800 feet across, which would have been the grand Nazi meeting house. All of this vision of it, this utopian vision of a culture based on a regression to a theocratic state with a god king as the central ruler, the institution of slavery, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and a murky racial metaphysics about racial hygiene, eugenics, and ethnic cleansing. All this kind of nonsense as a sort of utopian ideal for the Germans versus the Allies world, which has come to prevail, the liberal democratic world of a capitalist utopia, basically the transformation of the world into a gigantic shopping mall, which is precisely what has come to happen. Those values have come to become now the basis of globalization. So we have that war as a war basically over two different utopian visions, and the Allied vision prevailed. But in Horkheimer and Adorno, they were both Marxists. They are the founders of critical theory, and this text, the Dialectic of Enlightenment, is one of the founding texts of critical theory, and it is probably their most famous book. Certainly Adorno's most famous. It was put out in 1944. It was written during World War II and put out in 1944 in limited edition, and then published in 1947 in Amsterdam in a larger edition. And it is, as I've said, being Marxists, it represents a third set of values, since they are critical both of the kind of fascistic world state that was being erected by the Nazis on the one hand, but also they are equally critical of the dehumanizing aspects of liberal democratic capitalism on the other. So we have a third set of values here. And the book is very interesting in critiquing that, because what it essentially does, it's another one of these books that's sort of like Decline in the West, in the sense that it represents the situation of modernity as yet another type of catastrophe, basically a giant catastrophe, that the end goal, the inevitable development and outcome of the Enlightenment has resulted in a huge catastrophe, the degradation and the dehumanization of the individual. And what the book is then is that it amounts to a sustained attack on modernity from three different planes. They attack it on three different levels: the political, the economic, and the cultural. Insofar as it is an attack on the political plane, it's largely an attack directed against fascism, which they regard as a regression to mythology, to the irrationalism of myth, which is a betrayal of the Enlightenment idea of reason as man's noblest and greatest and highest faculty, on the one hand. And then it is also, on the economic plane, a sustained critique of the world that liberal democratic capitalism has built, the bourgeois industrial world, which has ended up dehumanizing the individual by putting him in servitude to the machine, basically, as his highest ideal. And the attack on culture with the Adorno's essay on the culture industry, in which mass culture creates a set of prefabricated stereotypes and cliches that rob the individual of autonomy. In all three cases, what we'll see is that what happens, what Horkheimer and Adorno say has happened in modernity, is that these three different calamities on the part of fascism and the culture industry and liberal democratic capitalism, what has happened is that the legacy of Enlightenment, it's the crown jewel of the Enlightenment, they're going to say, what it represents is the fully realized creation of the three-dimensional subject, the autonomous self, motivated out of his own center, of which Kant represents, as Horkheimer describes it in his essay on Juliet, or Enlightenment and Morality, of which Kant represents the sort of highest achievement. The individual, motivated by reason, and it's reason in the higher sense, that is capable of conferring synthetic unity upon the manifold of concepts that the understanding, not reason, but the understanding uses to make sense out of the manifold of sense perception that appears to it, and uses the categorical imperative to will that insofar as you act, you will your action so that it should become a universal maxim by way of which all humans should ideally comport themselves. And so we have this idea of the autonomous individual, the creation who's capable of making his own decisions, modeled and guided by the universal light of reason, completely, thoroughly autonomous, and also the creation of, with science, a set of axioms for dominating nature, for a fully realized system, as Kant spends most of the body of his writings working out, a fully realized system for subjugating nature, for dominating it, and imposing over it with a systematic order and worldview. So they say basically that this achievement of the fully realized subject, the three-dimensional self, is, with these three calamities on the three different planes of the political, the economic, and the cultural, that three-dimensional self is crushed and collapsed into a mere two-dimensional idea of individuality, in which the human individual is robbed of autonomy, loses his sense of being a true individual, capable of forming his own critically reasoned judgments, of motivating his own actions from his own center, of deciding for himself. All of that is compressed and flattened out by the disasters of fascism, which flattens out the individual into a servant of the state, which does all its thinking for him. Or in the case of the culture industry, the individual loses his sense of autonomy by being spoon-fed prefabricated stereotypes that are manufactured by the culture industry, archetypes, stereotypes, cliched opinions, prefabricated opinions that are fed to him through the mass media, that he or she simply absorbs and assumes as true, and does not bother to question this capitalist ideological construction of reality. It's basically capitalist ideology that they're spoon-fed and robs them of any true sense of individuality. And then the same thing on the economic plane, the calamity of the creation of bourgeois industrial capitalism, which degrades reason from an ennobling principle to merely a tool to be used for the making of other tools and for the purpose of aligning the human being with the machine so that he fits right into it and has to contour himself to the contours of the machine and basically becomes a servant of it. That also flattens him out, robs him of individuality. So in each of these calamities, we can see that this idea that Horkheimer and Adorno have is of the three-dimensional individual who is collapsed into a mere two-dimensional parody or a caricature of individuality. It's a very good critique, and it's very thorough and efficient, and one in reading the book can see why it has become as famous as it has, because it's utterly devastating and it's very difficult to argue with. I think their conclusions are quite good and they're quite sound. Although I do have a number of quibbles, as we'll see here. The book's opening essay is by Horkheimer, and it's on the concept of enlightenment. And what Horkheimer does then is to go through, he goes back over history. Anyone who's read Jean Gebser's Ever-Present Origin should probably read this book, because basically it talks about the struggle between what they call is the dialectic of enlightenment is really the struggle between enlightenment and myth. Enlightenment is reason, myth is, they say, the irrational. That human evolution, the evolution of human culture in the West has gradually liberated itself from the irrationalities and the tyranny and its subjugation to the mythic, irrational worldview. That's what this opening essay is about. And so, in a sense, what Horkheimer is doing here is to describe the collision between what Gebser calls the mental consciousness structure on the one hand and the mythic and magical consciousness structures on the other. That's what these first two essays are about. The second essay is Adorno's essay on the Odyssey and how the Odyssey bears this out as well. But in the opening essay, so Horkheimer goes back then and he describes the movement of history as basically a movement between what he calls the mimetic mode of behavior to the mythical mode of behavior, to the metaphysical during the Enlightenment, that's the metaphysical, the Kantian metaphysical, the grand use of reason as an ennobling faculty, to its degradation during the decline, the decadent phase of the Enlightenment as positivism, where reason simply becomes a mere tool for the making of other tools, and it degrades the human being. So we get a movement from the mimetic, which Horkheimer sees the mimetic is basically what the primitive magician does, the shaman, who manipulates nature based on sympathetic magic. The mimesis consists in the fact that if you want to cause certain things to happen, you need to perform certain rituals or utter certain magic words that are similar to the results that you want to bring about. If you want to cause harm to somebody, for example, you create an image of them as a voodoo doll, stick pins into it, or whatever the particular magical rite happens to be. It's this principle of mimesis. And then in the mythic period is the period in which consciousness is largely understood as the dominance of nature, the subjugation of the self, which is not yet fully formed and differentiated itself, to nature which is filled with demons, deities, and divine forces. And human thinking consists of images and symbols, and the human psyche, which is not yet differentiated itself, is largely to be thought of as a porous vessel that is capable of being penetrated by divine forces. Divine entities can seize possession of one's personality. You've got the phenomenon of exorcism, as in the Christian Gospel of Mark, where Christ performs all these exorcisms, or you have the idea of the poet being inspired by the muses, sing in me muse, so that the poet is merely a voice for a larger entity that speaks through him in the writing or composition of his poetic epic. In any of these cases, in all of them, what we have is a porous sense of self that is open to these transpersonal forces. And so the self largely has not differentiated itself from this gigantic background of cosmic, transpersonal, impersonal forces which nature is full of and which subjugate the human being and make demands upon him, such as human sacrifice, one of these demands that is made upon him, and that basically run his life for him. And that's more or less what Horkheimer means by the mythic stage that humanity has differentiated itself from in the process of enlightenment.